Today, I want to talk about some of the work of a man whose creations have inspired me for some time now, and who I've wanted to evangelize for more often, but I've been prohibited from doing that because so much of his work has just not been generally available. And the man I'm talking about is Ousmane Sembène. He's a Senegalese creator, a filmmaker, and a novelist, and he wrote and made movies for his own people, the people of Senegal, a former French colony in West Africa. And as I mentioned, his work has been hard to find, in big part because it's gone out of print. His novels were all originally published in English at one point or another, but they fell out of print, and many of them have not been reissued. There's only been a couple here and there. And his movies have suffered some of the same problems. However, the Criteron Collection, one of my favorite boutique video labels, has been taking it upon themselves to find his work and reissue it in beautifully restored editions. And most recently, they re-released 3 films of his from the 1970s in this nice box set. And the 3 films are called Emitai, Sedo, and Hala. And each one of these films explores some aspect of Senegal's history, the pre-colonial years, its colonized years, and its post-colonial experience. So the first of the bunch, Sedo, it takes place during the days of slavery. It's sometime in the 18th or 19th century. It's not very clear. It's left deliberately vague. This was a tactic on Sembène's part. And it involves a Senegalese king who has been converting to Islam and has also been trying to forcibly convert his own people to Islam as well. But the people decide that they still want to keep the nativist religions that they already have. And so they kidnap his daughter in protest. And 2 of the daughter's suitors get into a big foofara about who's going to rescue her. Both of them try to do it separately for different reasons, and they both get killed for their trouble. And all of this eventually turns into a civil war, where the slave traders and the missionaries that also benefit from the misery of the locals get involved as well. And as all of this is unfolding, we say to ourselves, the princess is probably going to have to save herself in this one, and we turn out to be not too far from the truth there. Emitai, the second of these films, is set during World War II, and it involves French soldiers, since at that time the country was a French colony, who are essentially holding a village hostage so that their rice crop can be used for the war effort. And many of their own people have also been conscripted and sent off to war. This was something that, according to what we see in the film, also happened during World War I. And there's a great deal of colonialist revisionism about how much of a great thing this was, this great patriotic effort that was made by the Senegalese. It's all, of course, propaganda. And so the people of the village, by way of the wives and mothers who stand most to lose, find ways to hold out and to resist. But it's very clear that this resistance only can go so far. And even a change in power at the top of the pyramid in France, from Pétain to Charles de Gaulle, will not mean anything for them in the long run. And the third film is Hala. And this is a movie I was already familiar with because I had seen a version of it before in a much worse condition print than what Criterion was able to restore and present. And also from its novel, which was written in, I think, 1974 or so, and the film followed shortly thereafter. The novel is one of the very few things written by Sembène that is available readily in English, in big part because it's also available in a digital edition. And it is set in modern 1970s Senegal, after colonialism has gone and Senegal has achieved its own independence. And it involves a businessman, an import-export maven, who's now getting married for the 3rd time. He's one of these people that has a highly hypocritical view of tradition. He will embrace tradition when it serves him. In other words, he converts to Islam as a way of being able to have that many more wives and that much more prestige in the eyes of his business peers. But he sniffs at the idea that he should do things like, for instance, engage in a potency ritual the night before his wedding. He scoffs at the whole thing and storms out of the room, and this is presented to him by one of his mothers-in-law. And so the night of the wedding, to this very young woman, he discovers he's impotent. He can't perform sexually. And he begins to go into a kind of a crazy spiral trying to figure out what's wrong with him. So he starts visiting various healers and paying all this money to try and get this curse lifted from him. The name of the movie, Hala, means the curse. And then he discovers, after having pretty much everything else in his life stripped away from him, where the curse really came from. And the final scene in the film, which basically involves his ritual humiliation, is honestly one of those left field endings you just don't expect coming. The whole thing it's very modern, both in its filmmaking and in its very dark, spicy humor. And it's my favorite of the bunch, in big part also because it's also the most accessible. The other two films, from the way that I described them, you might be expecting something a little more along the lines of, say, The Woman King, which, by the way, I really liked. But these are movies that have much smaller budgets than that. They also have a different acting style than you would expect in a Hollywood movie. It's much more declamatory and theatrical, and the pace is slower. Don't expect Hollywood. Because Sembène was making films for his people, he was also using acting styles and dramatic construction that would have been that much more familiar to them. The way he described movies was, he said, it's like the people's night school. And he wanted to be an educator in the way that he wanted to show people through their own language, through their own idiom, through the familiarity of experiences that they knew from their own culture, all the lessons that he felt that they needed to have in the modern day. So now, how does all of this relate to science fiction and fantasy? Well, the first part of it, for me, is about diversification of reading and viewing habits. And this is something that I have undertaken for some time now, in big part because it's just part of my natural curiosity. I'm just interested in everything. And also because I've discovered that when you see things or read things that were created quite intentionally for audiences that are not you, it forces you to think a little bit about the target. What kind of dramatic style, like I was talking about, what kinds of stories. And if you're writing something that is intended to feel like it's being aimed at an in-universe audience, it can be useful to see some examples of that from other cultures to give you an idea of what that would feel like and how those things could be constructed. You know, what kinds of expectations are you trying to set up or break with your audience for? Another aspect of how this relates to science fiction and fantasy, for me, specifically in Sembène's work, is how the past, the present, and the future all interface and influence each other in culture. In his movies, there's a lot of examples of how there's tension between the preservations of tradition versus progress, which sometimes is just in the form of violent change, not necessarily for the better. And also getting us to think about what was really true about our past, or what the best parts of our past really were, and what parts of that were just propaganda or cultural accruals, things that we don't know how to part with because we've lived with them for so long. In Sedo, for instance, you have the tension between the native religions and Islam. And in both cases, they put the people last in favor of control and violence. And there's actually a fascinating moment in the middle of the film where one of the missionaries, a Christian missionary, has a fantasy sequence that appears to be a flash forward into the future of the country, which includes a fairly sizable Christian population. With Emitai, that movie was made for a modern Senegalese audience to awaken them to a way that their colonial past really did work, in contrast to the whitewashed versions of heroism and sacrifice in World War II and also in World War I, which is directly invoked in the film. He wanted to show them this is what the colonial experience really was like for your grandparents. These heroic statues that were erected in their memory doesn't tell the whole story. And with Hala, it's a satirical look and how tradition can remain abused for the sake of power, and how all of the modernity that are claimed by these professional Senegalese still remains an obstacle to things like real progress. And one of the other key themes in the film is feminism and how it mostly remains a nice idea, not really enacted. And also, as you can imagine, the corrosive effects of new money. So as far as science fiction and fantasy goes with Sembène's work, it's a way to experience other voices and other worlds that are right here among us and that are worth listening to and appreciating on their own terms because they're being made for those other voices. The native cinema of any country, something that's made by and for its own people, always has these kinds of lessons of perspective. And this was something that was introduced to me by the person who first made me aware of Sembène's work, and that was the film critic Roger Ebert. And whenever he wrote about Sembène, whenever it was because he was reviewing one of his films or because he had met the man at Cannes and was talking about his career, he always wrote about him as a figure that really needed to be better appreciated in the West simply because so many people like him were not. And in the meantime, I encourage you to check out the most recent reissues. They're available on disc and also through the Criterion streaming portal, which, by the way, is one of the best investments you'll make if you're interested in movies from around the world generally. And so I hope more of his work overall gets back into our hands for all of us to enjoy and learn from, whether we're science fiction and fantasy writers or not. See you soon.